The wind came up the ravine hard enough to lean into, and at its lip two figures stood close in the last gray light, the way people stand when one of them has decided something. Loose shale ticked and slid under their boots. The woman's knuckles were bleeding. The man's voice stayed low and reasonable, the voice you'd use to gentle a horse, while he held a folded paper out to her across the drop. And on the bottom of that paper was her own name, in a hand that was not hers. He held out the pen. The sky behind them had gone the color of a bruise, and nowhere on the ledge was left to step back to. By the time Lenora Mercer understood that her husband meant to kill her, she was already falling. The paper had come out of his coat at the lip of the ravine, an assignment of the Juniper Bell claim, her name written at the bottom in a hand that was not her own. She refused to touch the pen. Clifton struck her across the mouth. When she clawed at his face and turned to run, he set both hands against her shoulders and pushed. The shale chute took her down on her back, 30 feet of loose stone that slid like water under her. Then the ground fell away again and threw her another 40 feet through scrub oak and broken limestone. She came to rest on her side at the bottom of Coyote Ladder Canyon with her mouth full of blood and grit and the cold taste of iron. Above her, small stones were still clicking down into the dark. She heard boots at the rim. She heard her husband's voice come down flat and unhurried, the way a man speaks when he has already decided how a thing will end. "You should have signed it," Clifton said. "I gave you every chance." Then the boots went away, and the last stones went still, and there was only the wind coming up the throat of the canyon. She did not know how long she lay there. When she came back to herself, the light had gone gray, and the cold had climbed into her clothes. She tried to sit, and the pain took her breath, 2 ribs on the left side grinding when she moved, a fire down the length of her right thigh where a spur of rock had opened the wool of her dress and the skin beneath it. Her right ankle would not answer at all. When she pressed it against the ground to stand, the joint rolled loose, and she went down again with a sound she did not recognize as her own voice. She made herself count what she had, because counting was a thing her father had taught her to do when panic wanted to take the wheel. She was 7 miles from the Salazar place, the nearest occupied ranch. She had no horse. Clifton had led both animals back up the trail. She had a wool dress, 2 petticoats, boots, a shawl, and a small folding knife in her pocket. She had a brass match safe with 7 matches in it. She had a single silver dollar, and sewn into the lining of her corset, where Clifton had never thought to look, the original location certificate for the Juniper Bell lode. She had no food. She had no water she could reach, and the sky in the west had gone the color of a bruise. The storm her husband had watched all morning was coming down out of the Capitans, and the temperature was already dropping through her wet clothes toward a night that would kill an uninjured woman, let alone one who could not walk. Walking out was not a choice. 7 miles on a ruined ankle in the dark into a rising wind would end with her frozen under a piñon before she made 2 of them. Staying where she lay would end the same way, slower. That was the arithmetic. It did not balance. There was no line in it that led to morning. Lenora Voss Mercer was 28 years old, and until that afternoon she had believed she understood the man she married. She had grown up near Las Vegas, in the north of the territory, the daughter of a German assayer named Voss and a New Mexican mother who had taught her Spanish and taught her to keep her own counsel. Her father tested ore for other men's claims his whole life and owned nothing of his own until the very end, when a marginal quartz outcrop in the Capitan foothills essayed higher in one narrow pocket than anything he had ever run across another man's table. He located it, filed it, named it the Juniper Bell for the tree that grew crooked over its collar, and assigned it to his daughter in writing before he died, so that no husband and no court could take it from her without her hand on the paper. She had married Clifton Mercer 11 months after the funeral. He was a freight broker out of White Oaks, quick with figures and quicker with a compliment, and in her grief she had mistaken his confidence for the same steadiness she had lost. She learned the truth slowly, and then all at once. He had borrowed against wagons he did not own. His creditors were closing, and the juniper bell's one rich pocket, the pocket her father had bled for, was the only thing standing between Clifton Mercer and ruin. He had asked her to sign the claim over to him twice. She had refused twice. She understood now that the boundary cairn he claimed had been moved was a lie built to get her alone at the edge of a 40-foot drop. Lying in the shale with the cold working into her bones, she thought about how neatly it would go for him. A wife who wandered off after an argument about a mine. A body that might not be found until spring, if ever. A grieving husband with a signed assignment in his coat, and no one alive to say the signature was forged. She thought, he does not even have to lie very much. The wind gusted and drove ice crystals across her face. She turned her head to escape it, and that small movement saved her life, though she would not know it for another hour. When she opened her eyes, she was looking at the underside of a broad slab of limestone that had shed from the canyon wall, and the darkness beneath it was not the darkness of shadow. It was deeper than that. It had a shape. She began to drag herself toward it, because the wind could not reach behind the slab, and behind the wind was the only direction left that did not end in the open. Above the canyon, the storm held off through the night and broke gray and bitter over the ridge the next morning, and it was into that morning that Clifton Mercer rode back to Coyote Ladder Canyon with witnesses. He had thought it through. A man whose wife has vanished does not sit at home. He went first to the White Oaks camp and then out to the road, and by the time the sun cleared the eastern rim, he had 2 hired riders behind him, and riding at his stirrup, a man whose word carried weight in that country, Dr. Anson Bell, 54 years old, the civilian physician who tended soldiers out of Fort Stanton and ranch families and mining men from the Jicarillas to the Hondo. Bell was not a friend of Clifton's. That was the point. Clifton did not want a friend. He wanted a witness no one could accuse of loyalty. They found the churned ground at the rim, the dark stain drying on the shale, the torn strip of gray wool caught on a scrub oak 40 feet down. Dr. Bell dismounted and went to the edge and stood a long time looking at the drop and at the sky and at the blood. "How far down does that go?" he asked. "Better than 70 feet to the bottom, all broken rock," one of the riders said. Dr. Bell knelt and touched the stain with 2 fingers and looked at the color of it. He looked at the length of the fall. He looked at the frost still lying blue in the shadowed places where the sun had not yet reached. "What was the low last night?" he said. It was not a question. "Down here in the bottom, out of the wind. No. In the wind, worse." He stood, and his knees cracked, and he wiped his fingers on his coat. "I'll say it plainly because you'll want it plain. If the fall did not kill her, the cold did. There is no third answer. No injured person lasted that night down there." Clifton let his face do the work a grieving man's face should do. "You're certain?" "I have pulled men out of less than that in July and lost them," Dr. Bell said. "This is not July. She's somewhere at the bottom of this ravine under the brush, or she's under the next drop below it. You'll want to bring rope and daylight and strong backs, and you'll want to prepare yourself for what you find." He looked at Clifton with something that was not quite suspicion, because he had no reason yet for suspicion, only the ordinary distaste of a man delivering a verdict to a husband who seemed to be bearing it well. "I'm sorry." It was an honest verdict. Dr. Bell was a careful man, and he was not wrong about the cold or the fall or the night. He was wrong about only one thing, and it was a thing he had no way to know. He did not know the cave was there, 60 feet below the doctor's boots, in a darkness that had swallowed the last of her matches. Lenora heard the voices come down thin and warped through the rock and could not make out a single word. She knew only that men were above her, and that one of the voices was Clifton's, and that if she cried out, she did not know which of them would come, so she did not cry out. She lay still in the dark and listened to her own husband arrange her death, and she kept the secret that was keeping her alive. The night before, when she had dragged herself behind the slab, her sleeve had snagged on iron. She had thought at first it was a root or a spur of ore, but her fingers found a ring, a rusted iron ring, thick as her thumb, bolted through a flat piece of slate that lay under a skin of gravel, where no flat slate had any business being. Slate does not lie flat and squared in the bottom of a canyon. Someone had set it there, and through the seam around its edge came a breath of air that was not cold. She had wedged the blade of her folding knife under the lip of the slab and used her one good leg against a boulder for leverage, and the slate had lifted 2 grinding inches, and warm air had poured out over her cold hands like water. Then the slab had come up all at once, and she had slid through the opening into a stone throat and fallen 9 feet, she guessed later, though it felt like a mile, tearing her shoulder on the way down and knocking her one lit match out into darkness. She had spent that first night at the bottom of that throat, in a squared stone entryway with the ruined stubs of a timber ladder above her and a black tunnel opening off to one side, large enough to crawl into. She had not crawled. She had not dared. She had wrapped herself in her own damp wool and pressed her back to the driest wall she could find, and she had woken again and again through the dark with her hand at her own mouth, testing whether she was still breathing, certain each time that the air had gone bad, and she had simply not noticed dying, but the air had not gone bad. And when the gray light of morning found the seam of the hatch above her, she understood that she was warmer than she had any right to be. Not warm. The cold was still in the stone and in her bones. But she was not freezing, and outside, where the wind was, she would have been dead. She struck her second-to-last match and looked at the tunnel. Her father's voice came to her then, from a long way off, from a day she had not thought of in 15 years. He had taken her down into an abandoned adit when she was a girl, holding a candle against a crack in the rock. The flame had bent sideways, hard, though the air on her face felt perfectly still. Stone looks silent, he had told her, only to people who never learn to watch it breathe. Air moves where you cannot feel it. Follow the flame, and you'll find the door. She held her match up to the mouth of the tunnel. The little flame leaned. It leaned inward, toward the black, steady and certain, drawn by something deeper in the mountain that was pulling the air along. There was a door somewhere ahead, and where air could move, a person might. She put out the match to save it, and she began to crawl. If you have ever had someone look at what you were doing and decide, without asking, that it could not possibly work, tell us in the comments. Lenora had a whole town about to make that decision for her. She just couldn't hear them yet. The tunnel ran level for what she counted as 25 feet, floor smoothed by old hands and old water, and then it opened into a chamber so large that her third match could not find the far wall. She lit it anyway. She had to see. The room was wide, 28 feet across. She paced it later on her knees. And long, better than 40 feet, the ceiling arching to 14 feet at the center and dropping toward the back. And it was not empty. That was the thing that stopped her breath. Along the near wall ran a course of stone shelving, dry, stacked, and level, the work of a mason, and not of nature. Bunk frames had been built against the rock and had rotted and collapsed into heaps of gray timber. Iron hooks were driven into the seams. In the middle of the floor squatted a small iron box stove, its pipe rising up and vanishing into the stone overhead. And stacked along the back, past a low masonry partition that a hand had built to divide the room, sat crates, wooden crates, banded and stenciled. The stencils faded to ghosts, but readable in the matchlight. Army markings, freight markings, the kind stamped on stores that moved under contract to a military post. The match burned her fingers and went out. She had 2 left. Lenora sat in the dark with her back against the cold shelving, and let herself understand piece by piece where she was. Someone had lived here. Not lived, hidden. Someone had taken a natural chamber in the bones of the mountain and made it into a place a man could disappear into, with a stove and a stone larder, and a ladder to a hatch that no one would ever find who did not fall on it by accident, the way she had. And they had done it long ago. The timber was punk. The iron wept rust. The canvas she pulled around her shoulders came apart in soft, rotten sheets. She reached out in the dark and found a shallow basin worn into the stone floor near the back wall, where water had gathered from some seep above. She put her fingers in it and flinched, then made herself understand what her fingers were telling her. The water was cold, but it was not frozen. Outside, on the rim 70 feet above her, water in a bucket would be a solid disk of ice by now. Down here in the stone, it ran liquid over her hand. The chamber held a cool that did not deepen into killing cold no matter what the night did overhead. She did not have the words a modern man would use for it. She only knew what her father would have said, standing in an assay office with a piece of country rock in his hand. Stone keeps its own weather. That was the whole secret, and she had already half grasped it. The mountain did not care what the sky did. Deep in the rock, the temperature settled and stayed, near the year's own average, warmer than the worst nights and cooler than the worst days. And it moved so slowly that a single winter storm could not reach it. The outlaws, she was already calling them that in her mind, whoever they had not built a warm room. No fire made this place. They had found a room the mountain kept at a steady, survivable cool, and they had learned to live inside its patience. But a steady cool was not the same as safe. She had understood that too, in the small hours, listening to her own breath. A sealed room fills with what a body breathes out. A stove burns the air a person needs. A hole in the ground could keep the cold off you and smother you all the same, and no one would ever know the difference when they found the bones. So the outlaws had done one more thing, and it was the thing that had saved her before she ever knew it. She could feel it now, in the dark, when she held her hand up. A slow draw of air across the chamber, cool coming in low near the floor from one direction, and something rising and leaving up where the stovepipe went into the stone. She remembered the flame leaning in the tunnel, air moving where she could not feel it. Whoever built this place had opened the mountain at two heights and let the warm, used air climb out the top while fresh air drew in below, the way smoke climbs a chimney whether or not anything is burning. It was not a miracle. It was a machine made of cracks and patience. And like any machine, she thought, it could break. She lit her fourth match. She was down to one after this. And by its light she took the measure of the crates, because whatever came next, it began with knowing what she had to eat. She did not tear them open and gorge. Her father had run enough spoiled samples across his table to leave her with a horror of trusting a thing just because she wanted it to be good. She worked the lid off the nearest crate with her knife and looked, in the last light of the match, at rows of tins gone soft and swollen at their seams, their contents turned in 20 years to something that would kill her faster than starving. Those she would not touch. But beneath the tins, in an inner box lined with waxed cloth, were dry stores that the damp had never reached. Beans hard and sound when she bit one. Rice. Sugar gone to a solid block. Coffee. A twist of salt. And there was hard bread, the flat gray army biscuit, most of it fouled with weevils and green mold at the edges, but some of it, deep in the box, still hard and dry enough to save if she was willing to crack each piece and pick it clean. She counted it in her head as the match died. 20-odd pounds of beans once she pooled the sound tins, a dozen of rice, sugar and coffee and salt, perhaps 18 pounds of biscuit after she threw away everything spoiled, blankets, if the wool ones under the canvas were as sound as they felt, candles in a stone niche, and soap and needles and horn buttons and a coil of lamp wick. It was food. It was real. And it was not nearly enough. Even eating like a starving woman, even stretching every ounce, she was looking at half a winter, maybe less. And she was hurt. And a hurt body burns more than a whole one. The chamber would keep the cold off her. It would not feed her. It would not set her ankle or close the wound in her thigh that she could already feel going hot and tight under her fingers. The last match burned down to nothing in her hand. She sat in a darkness more complete than any she had ever known, in a dead outlaw's larder inside a mountain, 70 feet under the man who was telling the county she was dead. And she made herself say the two choices out loud so the dark could not pretend there were more. I go up, she said, and I freeze in the canyon before I've crawled a mile. Her own voice came back to her small and flat off the stone. Or I stay down here, in the cold and the dark, and I make this hole keep me alive. 70 feet above and 7 miles away, in the front room of her boarding house in White Oaks, a woman was already refusing to believe the story Clifton Mercer had begun to tell. Rufa Salazar was 42 years old and had buried a husband and 2 seasons of cattle and had kept a roof and a table running through drought and debt and rustlers by never once believing a thing simply because a man said it with confidence. When word came that Lenora Mercer had wandered off after a quarrel and likely gone over a drop in Coyote Ladder Canyon, Rufa set down the bowl she was holding and did not pick it up again for a long moment. She wandered off, Rufa said. That's what he's saying, said the freighter who'd brought the word. Doc Bell was out there, says nobody could have lived the night, hurt and cold like that. I'm not asking about the night. Rufa's voice had gone quiet, which anyone who knew her understood was the dangerous register. I'm asking why a woman who refused to sell that claim to my face, twice, in this room, would walk off into a storm and leave the certificate behind. I'm asking why she'd leave a horse, leave her father's paper. She was stubborn as a fence post, that girl. She was not careless. There's a difference, and Clifton Mercer knows it as well as I do. The freighter shrugged, uncomfortable. Grief does strange things. He says she'd gone queer over the mine, obsessed like. Did he? Rufa looked out the window toward the Capitans, where the storm was still smoking off the peaks. She did not know about the hatch. She did not know about the cave, or the certificate sewn into a corset, or the warm draft moving through 70 feet of stone. She had no body to point to, and no witness to call, and not one fact she could set against a doctor's honest verdict and a husband's grieving face. She had only the shape of a lie, and the certainty cold and useless in her chest that she was looking straight at one. He'll have that claim inside the month, the freighter said. Widower's right. Sad business. It is a sad business, Rufa said. It is only not the sad business he's selling. But she let him go, because there was nothing to hold him with, and she went back to her bowl and her borders, and the lie began to set like plaster over the whole of White Oaks, while the only person who could break it lay under the mountain, deciding to stay alive. Lenora stayed. She could not have said afterward what tipped her, whether it was her father's certificate stiff against her ribs, or the memory of Clifton's flat voice telling her she should have signed, or nothing nobler than an animal's refusal to lie down. But once she decided, she stopped grieving the choice and began to work it, and work was a thing she knew how to do. The first days were counted in the smallest of victories. She found feeling along the shelves in the pitch dark, the stone niche of candles, and she rationed herself to stubs and to touch, learning the chamber by her hands the way she had once learned to read or samples with her eyes shut to test herself. She dragged the sound wool blankets off the collapsed bunks and beat the rot out of them and made a dry bed on a platform of stone that sat above the wet of the lowest floor. She set the shallow basin to catch the seep for water. She rebound her ribs with strips torn from a petticoat, and she cleaned the cut in her thigh with water and with the salt from the outlaw's larder and bit down on a strip of leather while she did it, because there was no one to hear her, and it would not do to waste the strength of screaming. And she turned her attention to the machine of cracks that was keeping her alive, because she had understood from the first night that it was failing. The stove was the danger. She wanted it. The cold was survivable, but it was still cold, and her wet clothes would never dry without heat. And a body healing needs warmth. It does not have to make itself. But the one time she had tried, on the second day, feeding a careful handful of the driest bunk timber into the little iron box, the smoke had not gone up the pipe. It had hung. It had spilled back out around the stove and pooled along the ceiling and stung her eyes, and she had put the fire out with her own water in a panic, coughing, her heart going like a hammer, and had lain a long while afterward with her cheek to the cool floor, breathing the good air that gathered low. She did what her father would have done. She stopped treating the failure as a mystery and started treating it as a fault to be found. She lit a candle and held it at the mouth of the low channel where she had felt the cold air enter, and the flame told her the truth. The draw was weak. It should have leaned hard, the way the match had leaned in the tunnel that first night. It barely moved. Somewhere in the throat of the lower channel, the passage that fed fresh air into the room was choking. She held the candle up to the stovepipe next at the ceiling, and the flame there guttered and swirled in a slow circle instead of streaming cleanly upward. Her father's lesson again turned now to her own survival. A flame that leans steady means air is moving as it should. A flame that flutters and circles means the air is turbulent or stalled, or worst of all, about to reverse and come back down on top of you. The chimney of the mountain was clogging, top and bottom both, and if she lit that stove without fixing it, she would not freeze. She would smother in her own warmth. So she worked on the machine. On her belly, one leg useless behind her, she reached up into the stovepipe with a length of bunk slat and brought down 20 years of soot and packed in the elbow where the pipe turned into the stone, the dried cup and sticks of an old bird's nest, some long dead swallow that had flown down the flue from the high fissure and died in the dark. She cleared it out in handfuls and coughed and cleared more. She crawled to the low channel and pulled loose gravel and a fall of small stone from its throat, widening the passage a finger's width at a time until the candle held at its mouth finally bent and stayed bent, drawing. She did not light a great fire even then. She lit the smallest one she could manage, a few sticks, and she kept the candle burning beside it the whole time as her only instrument, watching the flame at the stove, at the ceiling, at the floor. When the flame at the floor shortened, when the good low air began to thin, she killed the fire at once and did not argue with it. The chamber had taught her its one iron rule, the rule that the outlaws must have learned the same hard way or died learning it. The fire must never take more air than the mountain will give back. By the 6th day, she had a system of a kind, small fires, constant watching, water above the wet line, food weighed out in her hand against a winter she could not see the end of. She had eaten, she reckoned, less than a pound a day, and her body knew it. The dizziness when she stood, the way her hands had begun to shake at the ends of the long, dark hours, and the wound in her thigh had gone hot. She could feel it without light, the skin drawn tight and shining and tender, the ache of it settling into a deeper throb that she recognized and feared. Her father had died of a lung fever, but she had seen men in the camps die of less than a bad cut gone wrong, and she had no doctor, and she could not seek one because the only road to a doctor ran up the hatch and through the canyon and straight into the arms of the man who was counting on her to be dead. She was alive. She was warmer than the dead. She had food for part of a winter and air she had learned to keep clean and a bed above the wet. And she was going to lose it all to a wound she could not reach in the dark, with no one in the world who knew she was breathing. On the morning of the 7th day, As she lay listening to the seep drip into the basin and rationing her strength before she made herself sit up, she heard something new. Not the wind, not the drip. From high up, from the direction of the upper fissure, where the warm air climbed out of the mountain, came a small, hard clatter. Pebbles, a handful of them, knocking down the stone throat and rattling onto the floor of the chamber. Something had disturbed the ground above the vent. She went still. She held her breath and pressed her hand to her own mouth. The old gesture, the one from the first night. The pebbles stopped. There was a pause so long she began to believe she had imagined it. Then, working down through the narrow crack above her, feeling for a floor that was 14 feet below where any hand could reach, came the end of a wooden staff. It was a shepherd's crook, the hooked end of it, poking blind into the dark of her chamber from the world above. Someone was up there. Someone had found the breathing crack in the snow. And Lenora Mercer, 70 feet under the men who had buried her name, lay in the dark beneath that groping staff, and did not know whether the hand on the other end of it belonged to her one chance at living, or to the husband who had already tried once to put her in the ground. For a long moment Lenora did not move, and the staff did not move, and the only sound was her own blood in her ears. Then a voice came down through the crack, careful and low, an old man's voice speaking Spanish first and then English, as if he were trying both keys in a lock. "Is someone down there? Answer me. I felt the warm coming up out of the snow. Ground doesn't breathe like that with nothing under it." She said nothing. She had learned in 7 days of dark what silence was worth. "I know Mercer's men have been riding this canyon," the voice went on. "I know they say his wife went over the edge. If you're one of his, you can tell him Tomas Candelaria found nothing but a warm rock." A pause. The staff withdrew a few inches, then stopped. "And if you are her, if you are the one they buried without a body, then you should know that I am not one of his. I have hated that man since he sold me a lame mule and called it broke to harness. It was the mule that decided her. A man building a trap would not bother to be that small and that human." "I'm here," Lenora said, and her voice came out a cracked ruin she barely recognized. "I'm Lenora Mercer. My husband put me down here. Don't let him know I'm alive or he'll finish it." The staff went still. She heard the old man breathe. "Madre de Dios," Tomas Candelaria said softly. "You have been down there since the storm." Tomas Candelaria was 61, a widowed sheep owner who had driven army freight out of Fort Stanton in his younger years, and laid stone for the post besides chimneys, storehouses, the drainage channels that kept the cellars dry. He knew rock the way Lenora's father had known ore, and when he lay flat in the snow with his lantern lowered into the crack and saw, 40 feet down, the pale shape of a woman's face turned up toward the light, he understood two things at once. She was alive, and he could not get her out. "The crack I found is too narrow for a grown person hurt as bad as you sound," he called down. "And the old ladder hole, the hatch you came in by, that climb would kill a sound man. You could not make it with a bad leg." She heard him shift, heard the snow creak under him. "There is a way. There has to be a way. Every hole a man digs, he digs a back door too, in case the front one fills, but it will be buried, and we will have to open it, and that is days of work, not hours." "Then take word to town," Lenora said. "Tell the deputy. Tell anybody." "Tell them what?" Tomas's voice was gentle, and it was merciless. "That I found Clifton Mercer's dead wife alive in a cave the doctor swears she could not have lived to reach? Bell told the whole county no injured soul lived that night down here. They called off the search on his word. I bring them a story with no proof and a warm crack in the snow, and Mercer hears it before the deputy finishes his coffee. And then two things happen. He comes here and finishes you, and he arranges for old Tomas to have an accident on the road for spreading lies about a grieving man. A silence. No, we get you strong, and we open the back door quiet, and we do not go to anyone until you can stand in the daylight yourself and hand them the proof in your own 2 hands. You have proof? My father's certificate, she said, sewn in my clothes. The claim is mine. The paper he's showing them is forged. Then that is what we protect. The lantern swung, throwing her shadow huge across the chamber wall. I have water. I have cornmeal and dried meat and clean cloth. I'm going to lower them, and you're going to eat, and then you are going to tell me everything about the air in that room, because if the air was bad, you would already be dead. And if it is good, then somebody built something down there worth understanding, and understanding it is how we keep you alive until spring. The water came down first in a tin canteen on the cord, then a sack of cold cornmeal mush and a strip of dried mutton. Lenora had not known how hungry she was until food was in her hand, and she made herself eat slowly, the way she had made herself do everything slowly for 7 days, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. That was the beginning of it. Every 3 or 4 days, weather allowing, the old man came back to the crack above the vent with what he could carry, and lowered it and stayed to work. He would not simply feed her and leave. He had seen, in the first hour, that she was not a helpless thing to be pitied, but a mind that could be used, and Tomas Candelaria did not waste a good mind. He taught her the air first, because the air was everything. He lowered a fresh candle, a spool of black wool thread, and a small square of mirror glass, and through the crack he made her his hands in a room he could not enter. 3 places, he told her, low where the cold comes in, the middle where you sleep, high where the smoke should go. At the low channel the flame leaned hard and steady into the room, good cold air drawing in. At the middle it barely stirred. At the high flue it leaned up and out. That was the machine working, cold in at the bottom, warm out at the top, the whole mountain breathing slow through 2 holes at 2 heights. Now the other thing, Tomas said, a flame that leans and stays leaned is your friend. A flame that shakes, that goes in circles, that cannot make up its mind, that is air fighting itself, and a flame at the high hole that leans down, that pushes back into the room. His voice hardened. That is the mountain breathing backward. If you ever see the smoke come down instead of up, you put the fire out that same breath. Do you hear me? That same breath. She heard him. She hung wool threads at both holes so she could read the draw at a glance and learn to trust the wool more than her own cold skin. He lowered clay to pack around the seams where the pipe met the stone, so the fire drew clean and did not suck at the room, and he had her build a low baffle of loose stone before the cold channel, so the hard air spilling in would break and mix and soften before it reached her sleeping ledge. The outlaws were not fools, Tomas said, when she told him what she had found. But they were greedy about the low hole. They put the fresh air gallery too near the floor of the canyon where snow drifts. That is the flaw in their machine. Someday the snow will find it. He was quiet a moment. We will have to fix that, but first, the stone. If we are opening a back door, you will have to hold up rock over your own head, and I will not have it fall on you. So he taught her stone. He could not lay it for her. He could only lower flat stones on the cord, numbered with charcoal in the order he wanted them, and talk. She was to build a short arch, a corbel, he called it, each stone reaching a little further over the gap than the one beneath, the way swallows build under an eave, to hold up the roof of the old service passage where it had cracked and sagged. She dragged the numbered stones into place on her belly, her ankles screaming, and she began to build, and she made the mistake he was waiting for. She set the biggest, heaviest stone in the center of the span first, thinking the strongest stone belonged where the load was worst. Take it out, Tomas said. It's the strongest one. Take it out. She heard something in his voice she had not heard before, the flat certainty of a man who had watched a wall come down on a friend once and never forgotten it. The center stone does not carry the work. The center stone locks the work. It goes in last, after every stone on both sides is already pushing against it. You put it in first, it is holding up nothing, it is only waiting to fall. Build the sides. Let them lean into each other. Let the load spread across every stone equal. Then, at the very end, you drop the center stone into the gap it made for itself, and it locks all the others in place at once. A pause. Many small stones carrying the weight together will hold up what no single stone could hold alone. Build it that way, and it will stand after you and I are both dust. She rebuilt it his way. Sides first, both leaning inward, the load creeping across stone after stone. And when at last she wedged the center stone down into the waiting gap and felt the whole arch settle and grip and go silent under her hand, she understood she had learned something that was not only about rock. She did not know yet how completely the lesson would come back to her, in the dark, with fire coming down. She only knew the arch held, and he taught her, third, to mend her own body the way she was learning to mend the cave. He lowered blanket strips and thin crate slats and talked her through binding her ankles so the joint was cradled, but not choked, and he set her a discipline crueler than any rest. She was to stand, only until her hands began to shake, then stop at once, no arguing. Then a little longer the next day. He tracked her the way he tracked everything, out loud, so the numbers themselves became a rope she could climb. Day 9, she stood 20 seconds before the shaking took her hands. Day 13, she crossed the sleeping ledge, leaning on a single crutch cut from a bunk rail. Day 18, she lifted and moved a stone that must have weighed 10 pounds and set it where she wanted it and did not fall. Day 24, she climbed 6 feet up the slope of the reopened service passage and looked, for the first time in more than 3 weeks, at a thread of gray daylight leaking between the rocks of the buried back door. The food grew with the days because Tomas fed the cache as much as his household could spare. By the 3rd week, the shelves held what she counted over and over in the dark like a rosary: 45 pounds of cornmeal, 40 of beans, old and new, 12 of rice, 18 of hard bread picked clean, a dozen of dried mutton, 11 of the outlaw's sugar, 4 of lard, and a hoard of dried onion and red chili and coffee and salt. It was a winter's survival, barely, and only so long as the old man kept climbing to the crack. His own sheep and his own hunger set the limit. They both knew it, and neither said it, and the cave fought them the whole way. A slab peeled off the low ceiling one night while she slept and shattered a food shelf, and she woke to cornmeal spilled across a wet floor and spent a day on her knees saving what she could. She left a fresh sack of cornmeal leaning against the bare stone one careless evening, and the cave's cold sweat crept into it and greened it, and she learned, hard, to keep every ounce of food up off the rock. When they opened the back passage, too wide too fast, the mountain's warm breath poured out through it, and the whole chamber dropped several degrees in a night, and she lay shivering and understood that the door they were opening for her rescue was also a wound letting out her heat. Then Clifton's riders found the old man's tracks. Tomas told her about it through the crack, his voice tight. Boot and hoof sign in the snow near the ravine, and questions asked in town about what business old Candelaria had riding up a dead canyon in the dead of winter. He had to change his route, come the long way, leave his horse further off, and walked the last miles on foot through the drifts, which meant less on his back each trip. And in the fourth week, the wound in her thigh, which had never fully closed, turned in earnest. The fever came up like a tide. She lost a day to it, and most of another, and when Thomas came, he heard it in her voice at once, and did not leave that night. He could not reach her, but he talked her through it. Heat water, wet the cloth, open the wound at its worst point, and drain it. Salt in it, though it made her scream into the leather. Dr. Bell was 7 miles and a lifetime away, and to send for him was to send for Clifton. So the old man doctored her with words down a crack in the rock, and she doctored herself with her own shaking hands, and the fever broke near dawn. Someone else had begun to notice the old man's trips. Rufa Salazar missed nothing that happened on the roads around White Oaks, and she had marked Tomas Candelaria riding out 3 and 4 times in a fortnight, thin and grim, and telling no one his business. She stopped him in the yard of her boarding house one gray afternoon with a sack in her hands. "You're feeding somebody," Rufa said. It was not a question. Tomas looked at her a long moment. "I am checking my trap lines." "You've never trapped a day in your life. I've known you 30 years. She pushed the sack against his chest until he took it. "Dried beans," she said, "and clean linen, and a wheel of hard cheese." "I don't want to know who. If I know who, I can be made to say who. But I know Clifton Mercer is lying about his wife, and I know you're a man who won't leave a soul to die if he can help it, and between those two things I can do arithmetic." Her jaw set. "But hear me, Tomas. If you're keeping some poor creature in a hole this winter, thinking a hole is the same as safe, it isn't. A cave keeps its warmth on an easy night. But let one storm drift snow across the air it breathes, or the melt run in and fill the low ground, and your hole becomes a grave with a lid. You mind that." Tomas took the sack. He did not answer because he had no answer. Rufa had named standing in her own muddy yard with no idea she was doing it, the exact 2 ways the mountain could still kill Lenora Mercer. And that night, lowering the cheese down the crack, the old man told Lenora what the widow had said, word for word, because she deserved to know that even the people who might have saved her did not believe a cave could be made safe, and because Rufa was right. "She's right about the low gallery," he admitted through the rock, "and she is right about the water. We have started the new air passage, the higher one, that the snow cannot reach, but we have only cut half of it. If a storm comes before we finish—" He did not finish either. "Then we finish it," Lenora said. "How long?" 10 days of work, maybe 2 weeks, the way I have to walk in now." A silence full of weather. "Pray the sky gives us the 2 weeks. The sky gave them 9 days. By the last week of December, they had done everything but the one thing that mattered most. They had cleared the choked lower gallery so it drew clean, rebuilt and sealed the stove's connection to the flue, and hung a sliding damper of stone and stiff hide across the high flue, worked by a pull cord. Every food shelf sat 4 feet above the wet floor now. 20 feet of the service passage stood on her corbelled arches. A thin cord ran from the upper crack down to the iron stove, so a hand above and a hand below could signal each other. She slept in 2 places by turns, a high dry niche that held the warmth, and a lower ledge near the cleanest air for the nights the fever came back. Tomas lowered his own thermometer, the spirit glass one he used for his ewes and for reading the weather, and Lenora took the measure of her strange house at last. At dawn, up top, the surface stood at 19 degrees. In the hatch passage, 38. In the main chamber, 53. In her dry sleeping niche, 54, 55. And when she ran a small, careful fire in the stove, the chamber climbed briefly to 58, and then, when the fire died, sank back and settled again near 55, as if the mountain gently insisted on its own number and would not be argued far from it. That was the thing the numbers proved. The stove did not heat the cave. The rock was too vast for one iron box to warm. It dried her clothes and warmed the small space of her body for an hour, no more. The 55 degrees that stood between her and the death Dr. Bell had promised was not fire. It was the mountain, giving back its stored warmth too slowly for any one night to empty. It was working. She was living proof it was working, and it still was not safe, and both of them knew it, because the new high air passage that would save them if the low one drifted shut was only half cut. A raw, unfinished throat of stone that ended in a plug of rubble 10 feet short of open sky. Then Clifton Mercer met the old man on the trail. He came on Tomas afoot in the snow a mile below the canyon and sat his horse and looked down at the limestone dust ground white into the knees and cuffs of the old man's coat. "You've been laying stone," Clifton said. "A man doesn't get that on him checking traps. What are you building up, a dead canyon, viejo?" "Mending a spring box," Tomas said, "for the Aragon place. The frost cracked it." Clifton looked at him for a long time and did not believe him and could not prove it, which for a man like Clifton amounted to the same thing as an insult. "You owe me," he said at last, "that mule freight 2 years back. $11. It was a lie, and both of them knew it was a lie. Clifton leaned down and took the lead rope of Tomas's pack mule out of the old man's hand. "I'll take the mule against it, and I'll take your word that you'll keep off my canyon, or the next thing I take is more than a mule." He rode off, leading the animal, and Tomas stood in the snow with his empty hands and watched his ability to carry a load walk away up the trail. After that, the old man came on his own 2 feet, up the drifted miles, carrying only what a man his age could carry, which was less food to stretch until spring, no mule to haul the stone the high passage still needed. The calendar and the weather and the widower's cruelty all pressed down together on a half-finished throat of rock, 10 feet short of open air. On the 2nd of January, the wind came around to the east, and the wool thread at the low gallery, which had leaned faithfully inward for a month, faltered and hung and went slack. The storm came down off the Capitans in the last dark before dawn, and it did not stop for a day and a half. 14 inches of snow fell on the high canyon in some 36 hours, and the wind drove it 35 and 40 miles an hour along the ridge. And it did what Rufa Salazar had said it would do, and what Tomas had feared and could not prevent. It found the low air gallery, the greedy low hole the outlaws had cut too near the canyon floor, and it packed the drift against it and into it and sealed it shut. And the temperature outside fell off a cliff, from the high 30s of the day before down to 7 degrees above zero, the kind of cold that kills a lost traveler between one hill and the next, the kind of cold that finds every gap in a cabin wall and every soul caught out on a road. At first, the mountain held. That was the terrible, beautiful thing, the thing Lenora would try to make people understand for the rest of her life. When the world above dropped to 7 degrees, her chamber, sealed and drifted over, held at 53. The stone did not care about the storm. It gave back its slow, hoarded warmth exactly as it had all winter, and for the first hours of the worst storm of the year, she sat in a stone room 50 degrees warmer than the death outside, and she thought, for 1 hour, that she had won. Then the smoke would not climb. She had a small fire going when she noticed it, a careful fire, her hand near the cord as always. The flame at the top of the stove, where it should have streamed up the flue, began to shudder. She held the candle to the ceiling. The flame there did not lean up and out. It swirled, it circled. It could not make up its mind. The mountain was breathing backward. She put the fire out that same breath, the way the old man had made her swear she would, and she sat in the sudden dark and made herself think instead of fear. The low gallery was blocked, the wool thread told her, hanging dead. With the low hole sealed, the whole chimney had lost its pull. Warm air could not climb the flue if no cold air came in below to push it, and now the flue itself was starting to reverse. The storm's pressure shoving cold, and worse, whatever was up their back, down into her room. She had, at most, hours. The chamber would cool now that the stove was dead, and the good air would foul as she breathed it, and there was no one coming, because the only man who knew she was alive was 7 miles away and did not know the storm had sprung the trap. Tomas could not come. Clifton had seen to that before the snow ever fell. 2 days earlier, the old man had ridden into White Oaks for the last supplies, and Clifton had gone to the deputy and sworn out a complaint that Candelaria had stolen freight off his wagons in the autumn. It was a lie. But it was a lie with a mule in it, the very mule Clifton had taken, and while the deputy sorted the tangle, Tomas sat in town unable to leave, staring at the snow coming down over the mountains, knowing to the marrow of his bones what it was doing to the woman in the rock. So Lenora was alone, with everything the old man had taught her and no way to ask him what came next. She worked the problem the way he had taught her to work every problem. Find the fault, do not panic at it, fix the fault. The low gallery was sealed by snow she could not reach from inside, but the high passage, the new one, the unfinished one, was cut most of the way to open air. If she could open it, it would draw. It would give the mountain a new mouth to breathe through, above the drifts. She crawled to the service passage on her belly, dragging the leg that had never fully healed, and she tore at the plug of rubble at its end. And the mountain answered her the way it answered everything, without mercy. The rubble was not a plug she could pull loose. It was packed and keyed and settled, and when she pried at it, the passage above it groaned and let down a slither of fresh stone, nearly on her hands. She could not attack it standing. There was no room and no strength in her leg, so she lay flat on a plank and set her good foot against the largest stones, and pushed with the whole length of her body, her cracked ribs grinding, her breath coming in sobs, and she moved the debris an inch and two, and the air did not come. And then she felt the water. It reached her hands first, cold as the grave, running along the lowest seam of the floor. The warm spell before the storm had melted snow up the slope, and now that melt was finding its way down through the mountain the way water always does, and it was rising in the lowest passage, and it was climbing toward the bottom food shelf where a winter's survival sat stacked. She did not freeze. She did not flail. She hauled herself to the shelves in the dark, and she made the choice Tomas had trained into her without either of them ever naming it. She moved the food that fed a body first, the cornmeal, the beans, the sugar, the lard, the calories that stood between her and starving, up onto the highest dry shelf, and she left the blankets and the tools and the tin for last, because a blanket dropped in water could be wrung out and a pound of cornmeal drowned, was the day of her life gone. Clear priorities, not frantic hands, the old man's voice in her, choosing. Far above her, in the screaming white of the storm, Clifton Mercer found the vent. He'd come back to the ravine in the worst of it, and he had brought Lyman Sorrell, his freight clerk, the frightened, indebted man whose false witness held up the whole forged story, because Rufa Salazar had begun, in town, to ask her questions out loud where people could hear them, and Clifton needed to be certain that nothing at the bottom of that canyon could ever be found and used against him. And what he found in the drifted white was a place where the snow had gone soft and sunk into a hollow, melted from below by a breath of warm air rising out of the ground. He kicked the snow away. He found the crack. He put his ear to it. And down in the dark, hauling stone with her ruined body, Lenora heard, faint and impossible, the ring of metal above her, a boot heel, a tool, something hard on the rock at the top of the vent. Lyman heard it too, the sound coming up. "There's something down there," he said. His voice shook. "Clifton, there's somebody down there. She's alive. God forgive us. She is a dead woman," Clifton said, "who does not know it yet." He took Lyman by the coat. "You put your name on that assignment. You witnessed it. You forged nothing but you swore to it. And if she comes up out of that hole, you do not go to prison for a mistake. You go to the gallows with me for the rest of it. Do you understand what we are past now? There is no walking back from here. There is only making sure the ground stays shut." And Clifton Mercer gathered a bundle of rag and dry brush from his saddle, and he set it alight in the lee of a rock where the wind could not kill it, and he dropped the burning cloth down the crack, down the high vent, the mountain's mouth, meaning to fill the chamber below with smoke and finish, with fire, what the fall and the cold had failed to finish. The smoke came down. Lenora saw it before she smelled it, a dirty orange glow guttering at the top of the high passage where there should have been only dark. And in the instant before terror could take her, the old man's teaching took her instead, and she read it. "The smoke is coming down the high flue," which meant the high flue was drawing backward, which meant she almost laughed, a cracked and horrible sound, that her enemy had just told her exactly where her air had gone. If the high hole was pulling down, then the low hole was where she needed to open the draw, and the half-cut bypass she had failed to clear was the only path left. She yanked the cord and slammed the stone and hide damper shut across the high flue, cutting off the smoke's road down. Then she threw herself back at the rubble plug of the bypass, because now it was not one problem, but two racing each other. The smoke sealed above her would foul the air she had, and the fire that fed it was eating down the dry passage toward the timber and the shelves. She could not break the plug. She had tried with her whole body, and it would not yield. She lay against it, spent, her lungs full of the first thin threads of smoke, and she thought she was going to die 10 feet from open air. And then she remembered the arch. The center stone does not carry the work. Take out the sides and the center falls on its own. She had been attacking the plug at its face, at its center, at the biggest stone, Shutbert, the way she had once tried to build an arch. Wrong. She stopped fighting the middle. She found instead the two smaller stones at the shoulders of the plug, the ones the whole packed mass was leaning on, the keystones of the blockage holding all the rest, and she worked her iron rod behind first one and then the other and levered them out. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the whole plug slumped inward with a grinding roar, the center collapsing into the gap she had made for it exactly as her own arches had settled 100 times. And a blast of clean cold air came through the open passage and struck her in the face like river water. The mountain breathed. The chamber drew. The draft restarted, cold and pouring and alive. If you have made it this far into Lenora's fight, subscribe and stay with us, because that clean rush of air she just fought so hard to win is about to feed the one thing in that cave more dangerous than the cold. She had, in saving herself from the smoke, given the fire its wind. The burning brush Clifton had dropped, checked when she sealed the high flue, now caught the new draft roaring through the bypass. The flame that had been guttering woke and leaned and ran, traveling down the dry old debris in the passage toward the rotten timber of the ruined bunks and the wooden shelving where her food, her whole drowned and rescued winter, sat stacked. Fire in a cave is not the fire of the open world. It eats the air a body needs, and it fills the stone with poison, and there is nowhere for any of it to go but into your lungs. She did not try to beat it out. A beaten flame in that wind would only scatter. She did the thing the room itself suggested to her, the thing that used the machine instead of fighting it. She wrenched loose the length of the stovepipe, the iron chute she had cleaned with her own hands a month before, and she jammed one end of it into the pile of sand and cold, wet cave sediment she had scraped from the flooded low seam, and she used the pipe as a trough to pour that wet grit down onto the running fire, smothering the head of it where it reached toward the shelves. Then she took what fire was left, the stubborn burning core of the brush, and instead of trying to kill it in the timbered passage where it could spread, she dragged it with the rod into the stone-lined box of the hearth, where fire belonged, where stone on every side gave it nothing to climb, and there she let it burn itself small and harmless against the rock. Above her, in the storm, Lyman Sorrell watched Clifton Mercer feed fire down a crack onto a living woman, and something in the clerk that $11 of debt and one forged signature had not managed to kill finally stood up in him. He took the camp shovel off Clifton's saddle, and he swung it and caught Clifton across the shoulders and put him down in the snow. Clifton came up with his revolver out. The shot cracked flat and small in all that snow. Lyman Sorrell spun and fell against the rocks by the vent with a bullet through his shoulder, and Clifton Mercer stood over him one moment with the smoking pistol, and then the enormity of what the canyon now held. A shot man, a living wife, 2 witnesses to murder where there was supposed to be only a grieving husband, broke over him at last, and he ran. He floundered up out of the ravine and got to his horse and rode into the white blindness of the storm, away from all of it, leaving his clerk bleeding in the snow above the woman he had tried 3 times to bury. Lyman lay against the cold rock at the mouth of the vent, and his blood ran down into a crack, and it fell, drop by drop, into the dark where Lenora crouched over her small, tamed fire. She felt it before she understood it. A warm, wet spatter out of the ceiling where no water should be warm. She looked up, and she understood that someone was up there, bleeding, alive, close enough that his blood could reach her, and that he was the only bridge between her buried world and the surface, and that if he died in the snow, no one would ever know that either of them had been here at all. She could not climb to him. Her leg would not carry her up the shaft, and there was no time. But she could make a sound the mountain would carry. She took the signal cord and wound it around the cold iron body of the stove, and she took her iron rod, and she began to beat the stove against the stone of the wall. A hard, ringing, deliberate blow, and another, a rhythm no falling rock and no wind would ever make. The sound of a human hand refusing to be silent, traveling up through 70 feet of rock and out into the storm. Rufa Salazar and Deputy Octaviano Chavez were already in the canyon. They had been following Clifton. Rufa's questions in town had finally moved the deputy to ride out and look at the ravine himself, and Rufa had insisted on coming, and they had cut Clifton's fresh trail in the new snow and followed it up toward the ridge, and they had heard the single shot. And now, over the shriek of the wind, they heard something stranger and more insistent, a slow ringing knell coming up out of the ground itself, iron on stone, iron on stone, iron on stone, from a place where the snow had melted into a soft, dark hollow. They found Lyman Sorrell first, shot and freezing and babbling that she was alive. She was down there, God help them, she had been down there the whole time. And then Deputy Chavez cleared the snow from the hollow and found the crack breathing warm into the storm, and Rufa Salazar put her face to it and called down a name into the dark she had refused for 6 weeks to believe belonged to a dead woman. Lenora. Lenora Mercer. If that's you making that ungodly noise, you answer me right now. The knelling stopped, and out of 70 feet of rock, faint and cracked and unmistakably alive, came the answer. Rufa, get the deputy and find my husband before he runs. It took the rest of that day and most of the night, working the old service passage the deputy widened with a pick, to bring her up. When the lantern light fell on her, Deputy Chavez stopped where he stood because everything the doctor had told the county was wrong, and the wrongness of it sat before him wrapped in rotten army blankets. Outside, the storm was breaking and dawn came up on a world locked at 9 degrees, snow to the fence tops, a cold that had killed stock in 3 counties that night. And in the rock, when the deputy set his hand to the chamber wall, the stone was cool but not cold, and Lenora's lamp burned clean in air that moved, and the water in the basin on the coldest night of the year had never once turned to ice. 9 degrees, and a doctor's certainty that no injured soul could live it. And here she was, 50 degrees below the killing cold, thin and burned and feverish and alive in the trap meant for her grave. The mountain had kept her. The old man's lessons had kept her. Lenora Mercer had survived the night that was supposed to be impossible. But somewhere ahead of them, in the breaking storm, rode a man with a forged paper in his coat, and survival, she understood as they lifted her toward the gray light, was not the end of anything. It was only the moment the question changed. She had lived. Now she had to prove it, the forgery, the shove, the fire down the crack, before Clifton Mercer could reach a stage road and turn himself back into a grieving husband whose troublesome wife had simply, tragically disappeared. They carried her up into a world that had spent 6 weeks certain she was dead, and the world did not know what to do with her. Rufus Salazar put her in the best bed in the boarding house and would let no one but the doctor near her, and for 3 days Lenora slept and woke and slept. And on the second day word came up from the south that Clifton Mercer had been taken. He had made it almost to the stage road below Lincoln before the drifts, and a lamed horse stopped him, and Deputy Chavez had ridden him down in the open country with the forged assignment still folded in his coat and Lyman Sorrell's blood dried on his sleeve. That should have been the end of it. It was not the end of it, because a captured man is not a convicted one, and the whole county still had a doctor's word ringing in its ears that no injured soul could have lived that night. And if she had not lived it honestly, then the story Clifton was already beginning to tell from his cell, that his wife had faked her own death to steal a fortune, had a place to take root. So the first person Lenora needed was the man who had buried her with a sentence. Dr. Anson Bell came to the boarding house expecting to examine a fraud. He was a careful man, and careful men do not enjoy being wrong in public, and he had said his piece over that ravine in front of witnesses. He sat down beside the bed with his bag and his doubt, and he began, and within 10 minutes his face had changed. "These injuries," he said slowly. He had her ankle in his hands and the long-heeled seam down her thigh, and he was pressing the ribs that had knit crooked. "This ankle was wrenched 6-7 weeks ago and has been walked on since, hard, before it was ready. This wound was opened and drained and salted by someone who knew a little and had almost nothing. These ribs set themselves." He looked up at her. "No one fakes 6 weeks of healing. No one fakes a bone that grew back wrong because there was no one to set it straight. You have been hurt this whole time, and you have been somewhere that let a hurt body live." He sat back. "Where?" "I'll show you," Lenora said. "Bring your thermometer." He went down the reopened service passage 2 days later with the deputy and a lantern, and he stood in the chamber in his good coat while the wind screamed across the country above and read his own spirit glass at 52 degrees. And he put his hand in the stone basin and drew it back wet, not iced, and he was quiet a long time. Lenora showed him the wool threads at the 2 air holes, leaning steady in their opposite directions, and made him hold a candle to the flue and watch the flames stream up and out. He was a man who trusted instruments, and every instrument in that cave told him the same thing his eyes did not want to believe. When he came up, He did not wait to be asked. He said it in the street, in front of the men who had heard him say the first thing. "I told this county no injured woman could live through that night," Dr. Bells said. "I want it understood that I was right about the night. I was right about the cold and the fall and what they do to a body. I was wrong about one thing only, where she spent it. I did not know the cave was there. No man could have known, but it was there, and it held her, and everything I said follows from a fact I did not have." He looked at no one in particular and at all of them. She did not cheat death. She found a door out of the room death was standing in. It was as complete an admission as a proud man ever makes, and it did two things at once. It broke the back of Clifton's story, and it turned the doctor himself, the very voice that had condemned her, into her most credible witness. A woman claiming a miracle would have been laughed down. A woman whose survival was confirmed coldly by the physician who had pronounced her dead was something the county could not look away from. Deputy Chavez built the rest of it stone by stone, the way Tomas built a wall. He had the original certificate sewn all winter into her clothing, its location date and its monuments matching her father's filing. He had the torn corner of Clifton's first assignment still in Lenora's pocket from the day of the fall that fit the forged sheet Clifton carried like two halves of one wound. He had Lyman Sorrel, shot and mending and finally willing to talk, who described the forced signing and the fire down the crack. He had Thomas's account of Clifton's men watching the canyon and the oilcloth bundle Clifton had dropped in his flight, full of tracing paper and a smudged practice copy of Lenora's own hand. And he had the bullet the doctor took out of Lyman's shoulder, which would sit in an envelope until it could be laid beside Clifton's revolver. 6 things, and not one of them was only Lenora's word against her husband's. That had been the point all along, the thing Tomas had known when he refused to carry her up too soon. A wife's accusation could be dismissed as a hurt woman's spite. 6 pieces of physical proof could not. Rufa Salazar was harder to convince than the doctor, and that was exactly why her conversion mattered most. She went down into the cave herself once Lenora could walk, and she did not go down to marvel. She went down to find the lie, because finding lies was the skill that had kept her alive through drought and debt. She walked the chamber with a lantern, and she found what she was looking for. She pointed at the black scorch up the wall of the bypass where Clifton's fire had run. She pointed at the low seam where the floodwater had risen and left its rime of mud on the stone. "There," Rufa said. "That's where it nearly killed you. Fire from the top, water from the bottom, both in one night. And you want to tell this town it's a safe place to send their children in a storm?" Lenora did not argue. That was the thing that turned it. "No," she said. "It's not safe. It's survivable if you respect exactly the things that nearly killed me, and not one thing less. The fire ran because I let the wrong draft into a passage full of dry timber. The water rose because the outlaws cut the low air hole too near the canyon floor. Both of those are faults, and both of them can be fixed, and until they're fixed, no one comes down here but me. I'm not selling you a miracle, Rufa. I'm selling you a machine that will drown you or smother you the instant you stop paying attention to it." Rufa looked at her for a long moment in the lantern light. "Well," she said finally, "that, I believe. A woman selling a miracle I'd have thrown out on her ear. A woman telling me exactly how her wonderful cave can kill me." She almost smiled. "That one I'll listen to." From that day, Rufa Salazar was not a doubter. She was something more useful and more relentless, a believer who checked everything twice. Word of it spread the way water finds cracks. Through that first spring and into the next winter, people came, not crowds, but the ones with a specific fear and a specific need. A widowed homesteader named Prudencia Mares, whose dugout had frozen solid the winter her husband died, came to ask how a hole in the ground could hold heat when hers had not. A freighter who had lost 2 mules and nearly his own hands in a whiteout on the Carazozo Flats came to ask whether a man caught on the road could dig himself something that would do the same. Lenora told them the truth she had paid for. A dugout in loose earth was not a cave in bedrock. Ordinary ground gave its warmth back too fast, and a plain cellar with one hole was a box that would fill with a sleeping family's own bad breath before morning. What mattered was not finding a magic cavern. What mattered was slowing the loss of heat with earth and stone, keeping the sleeping place dry, and this above all, separating the hole that let air in from the hole that let smoke out, so the cold draft and the killing smoke never fought for the same throat. She would not let a soul leave with only words. She made every visitor come down into the refuge and do the thing that had saved her. She handed them a candle and made them read the flame at the low channel, at the middle, at the flue, until they could tell a healthy draw from a dying one at a glance. Then she made them put the candle out and find the way to the exit in the pitch dark by touch alone, because a person who could not find the door blind had no business trusting their life to a room without windows. The cold does not kill you by being cold, she told them again and again until it became the first thing anyone learned at Coyote Ladder. It kills you by taking your heat faster than your body can make it. Everything we do here is about that one theft. Slow the theft, and stone will keep a family alive through a night that would kill them in the open in an hour. If this story reminds you that preparation is not fear, that it is only deciding ahead of time what still has to work when everything else fails, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The proof of the difference came the hard way, as most proof did. Prudencia Mares went home from her first visit and dug herself an earth-sheltered room off her dugout, and she did most of it right, and she did one thing wrong. She cut a single hole for both air and smoke, because 2 holes were twice the digging and the ground was frozen iron. In February, a norther pinned her for 3 days, and on the second night the single flue backed its smoke down on her, the way Lenora's had once done, and she woke with her head splitting and her infant gone quiet and gray in her arms. She carried the child out into the killing cold, which was the only clean air left in the world, and she saved the baby on the open snow and lost 2 fingers to the frost doing it. When the weather broke, she came back to Coyote Ladder with her bandaged hand and stood in the chamber and wept, not for the fingers, but for how near it had been. Lenora did not comfort her with words. She put a candle in her good hand and made her read the flame at the low channel and again at the flue, and made her feel in her own bones the difference between 1 hole and 2. Cold drawing in low, smoke leaving high, never once fighting for the same throat. Prudencia went home and cut the second hole through frozen ground with a bar and a slow fire, and her family never had a bad night again. That was the true measure of the thing. Not that the refuge was a wonder, but that the whole distance between living and dying could be a hole in the right place, and Lenora could teach where to put it, and a person who learned it did not die. From his cell awaiting trial, Clifton Mercer heard all of it, and he did the only thing left to a man who has lost every other weapon. He picked up a pen. The letters went to anyone who would read them. His wife, he wrote, had not been left for dead at all. She had planned the whole thing, faked the fall, hidden in a cave she had known about all along, invented a story of murder to seize not just the mine, but the fortune and outlaw plunder that everyone now knew was buried in that canyon. He was the wronged one. He was the ruined husband of a scheming woman, and there was just enough shape to it. The cave was real, the outlaws were real, the county's own greed could fill in the rest, that the letters found readers. They did not save Clifton. Lyman's testimony and the tracing paper and the torn document had already sunk him too deep. But the letters did something Clifton may not even have intended. They put the word treasure into the air over Coyote Ladder Canyon, and treasure draws a different kind of visitor than fear does. But that reckoning was still ahead of her. First there was the work, and the old man, and the small good year they had before the mountain took him back. Lenora took the modest money the juniper bell threw off that season, the one rich pocket her father had bled for, worked now by a small honest crew instead of a desperate husband, and she spent it not on herself, but on the refuge, and she and Tomas spent the better part of a year making the cave into something that would forgive a mistake it had nearly killed her for. They cut a second air intake high up the slope this time, above the line where the snow drifted deepest, so that if the low gallery ever sealed again, the mountain would still have a mouth to breathe through. They hung 2 dampers where there had been one, so the draw could be split and steered. They built a proper masonry smoke chamber, so a fire's poison had somewhere to gather and cool before it ever reached the flue. They cut drain trenches into the low floor to carry meltwater away from the sleeping ledge instead of up into it. They whitewashed the stone around the places people would sleep, because Tomas showed her that soot and black mold hid on gray rock but shouted on white, and a wall that showed its own sickness was a wall that could warn you. They numbered the food shelves and marked them with rotation dates. They set a signal bell on the surface under a little stone hood so a person below could call for help and a person above could answer. And they fixed, hard and unbending, a limit on how many bodies the chamber's air could hold at once, because Tomas had taught her that a room breathes for the people in it, and too many lungs would foul the best-built air in an hour. When the town kept calling the place Mercer's grave cellar, Lenora refused the name to their faces. She would not let the worst night of her life become a ghost story for children, and she would not let it carry her husband's name. She called it the Candelaria Refuge, after the old man, and she made the name stick by using it until everyone else grew tired of correcting her. Tomas pretended to grumble about the honor, but the day they finished rebuilding the low intake together, the fault that had nearly drowned and smothered her both. She chose the order of the stones herself without asking him, sides first and the center stone last, and dropped the keystone into the gap it had made for itself, and the whole arch settled and gripped and went silent under her hands. And the old man, who had corrected her 100 times, said nothing at all. He watched the arch hold. Then he took the mason's hammer from his belt, the one that had laid stone at Fort Stanton before she was born, and he put it in her hand. "It knows the work now," he said. "It should stay with the one who does the work." They did not agree about what the refuge was for, and that argument ran under everything else that year like water under stone. Tomas believed a thing built well was its own justification. A wall should outlast the man who laid it, and never once ask to be thanked or admired. He wanted the refuge quiet, known to a few, permanent, anonymous as the drainage channels he had cut at the fort that had kept men dry for 30 years without one of them learning his name. Lenora wanted the opposite. She wanted every family in the county to know how it worked, to build their own poorer versions, to carry the knowledge out until a hard winter never caught anyone the way it had caught her. "You want to hand strangers a thing that will kill them if they do it half right," Tomas said. "I want to teach them to do it right," she answered, because they will try it whether I teach them or not. Neither of them won the argument, but she noticed that he never once refused to lower the numbered stones when a visitor needed to see how an arch was built. They were not always gentle with each other. That was how she knew it was real. They fought once, hard, about the winter travel. She wanted him to stop coming up the canyon in the snow, to send one of Rufa's boys instead, and he took it as an insult, as her deciding he was old in front of him. I laid the stone in your walls with these hands, he said, and you will not tell me they have gone useless while I am still standing on my own feet. She let it go because she loved him and because he was right that it was his to decide. She would come to wish later that she had fought harder and lost him a friend instead of losing him the way she did. She learned his whole life in pieces, over stone and coffee. The wife dead 20 years. The son who had gone to the mines in Colorado and stopped writing. How he had come to the freight roads out of the Army's leavings, and how the drainage channels he cut at the fort, the ones that taught him the trick of separating the water's path from the air's Z, were the same knowledge that had saved her without either of them planning it. His whole hard life had been quietly assembling the exact tools one stranger would need one winter, and neither of them had known it until she fell through a hatch onto the proof. The chest pain started that second autumn. He hid it at first, the way he hid everything, but she saw him stop on the slope with his hand pressed flat to his breastbone and his color gone, and she knew. She begged him to rest. He refused. There was one thing left he wanted to finish, the upper vent, the high new mouth of the refuge, sealed for the season against birds and drifting snow. He went up to do it himself on a bright cold morning, and she went with him, and near the top he stopped and looked down the whole length of the machine they had built together, from the high intake to the flue, to the warm, dry chamber far below, and he leaned on the mason's hammer that was hers now. I don't need to check your arches anymore, Tomas said. It was the highest thing he had ever said to anyone. Then they walked down together, and she thought there would be more mornings. He died 3 weeks later, at home, in his own bed, an ordinary autumn death of an old heart that had done too much. Not in the cave, not in the snow. In the quiet, with his own roof over him, which was the one mercy the frontier ever gave him. The mason's hammer hung on its peg above the main shelf of the refuge, where she had set it. There was old stone dust packed into the eye of it, gray and fine, ground in over 40 years of other men's walls and her own. She could have cleaned it in a minute with a wire and a breath. She never did. Some part of her needed the dust to stay exactly where his hands had left it. The upper vent he had climbed to finish was still half sealed the day they buried him. The morning after the funeral, Lenora went up the canyon alone in the cold, and she finished it, set the last stones herself, sides first and the center last, the way he had made her learn it until it lived in her hands. And when the arch settled and gripped and went silent, she stood a while in the wind with nothing to say to anyone, and then she went down into the warm dark and got back to work, because the work was the only prayer he had ever taught her. She did not have long to grieve him the easy way, by stopping. In January of 1886, on a hard, bright afternoon that turned in a single hour to a howling wall of white, a freight wagon coming down from the pass hit a sheet of glare ice on the canyon shoulder. The lead team went down thrashing, the wagon slewed, and the whole heavy weight of it rolled off the grade and came to rest on its side against the rocks, with one wheel still spinning in the wind. 14 people were on and around it when it stopped. A driver pinned with his leg broken under the box, 2 families traveling together to winter with kin, 3 children, and a pair of hired men, and the temperature was falling so fast that the sweat froze in the horses' coats. The nearest walls of any kind stood 7 miles off through a blizzard no one could have walked, except that they did not. They stood a quarter mile from a hatch in the ground that a woman had spent 2 years learning to keep alive. Rufa's eldest boy reached the juniper bell at a dead run to fetch her, and Lenora came, and for the first time she had to do the thing Tomas was no longer there to help her do. Everything he had taught her for one body, she now had to do for 14. She saw the danger before she reached the hatch, saw it the way he had taught her to see it, in her head before it happened. 14 sets of lungs would foul the chamber's air far faster than one. 14 bodies in soaked wool would chill the room instead of warming it, and the two frightened hired men were already shouting for a big fire, the exact fire that would eat the air the children needed and fill the ceiling with smoke. The injured driver could not be laid just anywhere. He needed the driest, warmest ground, or the cold would finish what the wagon started. She did not let the men build their fire. She stood in the mouth of her own cave, a thin woman leaning on a dead man's hammer, and she told 14 terrified strangers exactly what would happen and exactly what they would do instead, and something in the flat certainty of it made them obey. She split them between the two zones, so no single space had to breathe for all of them. She would not have one roaring fire. She heated stones in a small, careful blaze and wrapped them in the wet blankets, warming bodies without burning the air, the way Tomas had warmed her clothes without ever heating the room. She put the broken-legged driver, a big, quiet man named Emery Poe, gray with the pain of it, on the dry ledge that had once been hers. She rationed the food by the handful, and she set the able adults to a rotation, 2 at a time, climbing to keep the upper vent clear of the drifting snow so the mountain never lost its breath. For hours it held. Then, in the dead cold middle of the night, it nearly did not. She had let herself close her eyes for a quarter hour, and a hired man named Virgil Teague, a decent man, only frightened, only cold to the bone, and certain in the animal way that more fire meant more life, eased the stove damper wide and fed the little blaze up into something that threw her real heat. Lenora woke to the wrongness of the air before she understood it. The candle by the floor, the one she had set as her watchman, had shrunk to a bead. Across the chamber a child, one of the Ruiz girls, 7 years old, had begun to pull at each breath with a thin whistling sound. Her mother bent over her in the dark, not knowing what was wrong, only that her daughter was laboring in a room that should have been full of air. Lenora did not shout. Shouting spends air. She crossed the chamber and shut the stove down with her own hands and threw both dampers wide, and she made every soul in that cave lie flat on the floor where the last good air pooled, mothers over children, and she counted the minutes aloud in a steady voice while the mountain flushed its lungs. The candle by the floor stood up. It grew. It steadied. And the Ruiz girl's terrible whistling eased and became only the ordinary sound of a child breathing in the dark. That, Lenora said quietly to Virgil Teague, when it was done and his hands had stopped shaking, is why we do not build the fire. The cold takes hours. The bad air takes minutes. You will be cold tonight. Being cold is how you stay alive. He did not touch the damper again. None of them did. The chamber never fell below 49 degrees, and it never climbed past 54. Outside, the storm did what storms do. A rider caught on that road that night would not have seen the dawn. Inside, 14 people who should have died of exposure a quarter mile from shelter came up the next morning, cold and hungry and alive. All 14, the 3 children first up the passage into a scoured blue morning, blinking at a sun that had every right to be rising on their bodies instead. That was the day the country stopped arguing about whether the refuge worked. 14 lives in one night was not a story a doctor could revise or a jailed man could explain away. But success, she was learning, had its own weather. Clifton's letters had done their slow work. That spring she found the first sign of it, an outer passage of the cave torn open and dug through, shelving pried loose, the whitewash gouged, by someone hunting the outlaw treasure his letters had promised. They found nothing because there was nothing. The outlaw's only real leaving was the machine of air and stone itself. But the diggers came back, and others with them, drawn by the word treasure, the way the freighters had been drawn by the word shelter. The worst of them broke through a wall near the masonry smoke chamber, not knowing what it was, and for a week afterward the draw ran wrong and the whitewash bloomed black with soot before Lenora found the breach and sealed it. A hard lesson that a careless shovel in the wrong wall could undo 2 years of work and every life the refuge might yet save. She began sleeping some nights at the hatch with the mason's hammer beside her, an aging woman guarding a hole in the ground against men who believed a dead outlaw had left them gold. She had no gold to give them. She had only the thing the outlaws had truly left behind, which was worth more than gold to a family in a storm, and nothing at all to a man with a shovel and a rumor. She understood now that a place built to save the desperate could be destroyed by the greedy, and that the only thing standing between the two was her. She went into the deepest part of the installation to see how far the diggers had reached, past the masonry partition the outlaws had built, into a low, dry recess she had never fully cleared. And there, wedged behind a fallen shelf where 20-odd years of nobody had left it, she found a book. It was a ledger, water-stained and swollen but readable, the record the freight thieves had kept of everything they diverted in the confusion of the burning fort and everything they had traded it for in the years after, wagon by wagon, sail by sail, name by name. She turned the swollen pages by lamplight, and near the end, in a column of men who had bought stolen army goods and cattle moved under other men's brands, she found a name she knew. A name that still hung, respectable and gilded, over the biggest mercantile in White Oaks. The dead outlaws had a partner who had never hanged, whose son now sold flour and credit to the whole county and shook the deputy's hand at church. And the proof of it was in her lamplit hands in a book she was the only living soul to have read. For a long time Lenora sat with the swollen book open on her knees in the lamplight, and understood exactly what she was holding. It was the same weapon Clifton had held over her at the lip of the ravine, a piece of paper that could ruin a man. The name written in the ledger's back pages, in the column of those who had bought stolen army goods and cattle run under other men's brands, belonged to the dead father of Harlan Coldwell, whose mercantile fronted the main street of White Oaks, and whose credit reached into half the households in the county. The father had ridden with freight thieves in the burning year of the war and never once answered for it. The son sold flour and shook the deputy's hand at church and did not know yet that the proof of his family's beginning was sitting in a cave in a dead woman's hands. He learned it soon enough, because the diggers had loosened tongues, and treasure and old crime travel the same roads. Harlan Coldwell rode out to the Juniper Bell one afternoon in a good coat with a leather case under his arm, and he did not waste time being subtle. "I'm told you found the outlaw's book," Coldwell said. "I'd like to buy it. Whatever you think it's worth, I'll better it. A thing that old does no one any good dragged into the light. It only hurts the living for what the dead did." "You mean it hurts you," Lenora said. "I mean it hurts my mother, who is 80 and knows nothing, and my children, who carry a name I've spent my whole life keeping clean." He set the case on the table and opened it, and there was more money in it than the Juniper Bell threw off in a season. You of all people know what it is to have your name taken from you. I'm asking you not to do to my family what your husband tried to do to you." It was, she would think later, the most honest offer anyone ever made her, and the most dangerous, because it was almost right. She did know what it was to have a name stolen. That was exactly why she closed the case and pushed it back across the table. "I'm not going to sell it to you," Lenora said, "and I'm not going to use it against you either. Those are two different things, and I need you to understand that I'm choosing both of them on purpose. If I sell it, I'm your accomplice. If I keep it to hold over you, I'm my husband." She stood. "So I'm going to do the only clean thing left. I'm giving it to the deputy and the court, whole, every page, your father's name and all the rest, and they can decide what a 20-year-old crime by a dead man is worth. Maybe nothing. Your father's beyond any gallows now, but it won't be me who decides to bury it, and it won't be your money that does it either." Coldwell looked at her a long moment. "You could have been rich twice over," he said. "The syndicate for the cave. Now this." "I've noticed that about myself," Lenora said. She gave the ledger to Deputy Chavez the next morning, whole and unmarked, and she gave it in front of a witness so no one could ever say she had traded a page of it for anything. The territory did with it what territories do, which was very little in the end, the father being dead and the trail being cold. But that was never the point. The point was the choice, and the county saw the choice, and it was the last brick in a wall that had been rising around her reputation for 2 years. Clifton had tried to take a claim by forgery and murder. His wife had been handed a fortune's worth of leverage over a powerful man and had walked it straight to the law instead. People do not forget a contrast like that. It did more for the Candelaria refuge than any number of survived storms because it told every family in the county that the woman who kept the hole in the ground could be trusted with their lives, which was the only currency the refuge ever truly ran on. The treasure rumor died harder than the man who started it. The autumn before the trial, a party of 6 hard strangers rode up from the south with picks and a keg of black powder, certain that a woman would not stand between them and outlaw gold, and they began to break into the outer wall near the smoke chamber, the one careless blow that could ruin the machine for good. But Lenora was not alone at a hatch in the ground anymore, and that was the whole distance the 2 years had carried her. Amparo rang the surface bell, and the pattern the county had learned meant trouble, not weather, and by afternoon there were more than 20 men and women at the canyon head Duam, Emery Poe, walking sound on the leg the refuge had let him keep. The Ruiz men, freighters who had come up out of that cave alive on the worst night of their lives. Rufa Salazar, with a shotgun she was too old to need to fire, because the sight of her holding it was enough. They did not have to touch the strangers. They only had to stand there, a wall of the living, and let the 6 men understand that the gold they had ridden for did not exist, and the thing they were breaking was worth dying to defend to every soul on that ridge. The strangers loaded their powder and left. And when the ledger went to the court soon after, whole and public, and the county read that the outlaws' only leaving had been stolen flour and salt meat long since rotted, the word treasure finally went out of the air over Coyote Ladder for good. There was nothing to dig for. There had never been anything to dig for but the air itself. Clifton Mercer's trial came that spring, and it was not the drama the letter writers had promised. It was worse for him than drama. It was thorough. Lenora testified first, plainly, walking the court through the boundary lie and the paper and the shove, and the defense tried to make her the schemer Clifton's letters had described, a woman who faked a fall to steal a fortune. Then Deputy Chavez laid the physical things on the table one by one, and each one closed a door the defense had tried to leave open. The certificate her father had signed matching the ground, the torn corner from her pocket that fit the forged sheet like the 2 halves of one break, the oilcloth bundle of tracing paper with Clifton's own smudged practice at her signature, over and over down the page, a man teaching his hand to be hers, and Lyman Sorrel, mending and hollow-eyed, who pleaded guilty to his own part, and then stood in the box and told all of it, the forced pen at the ravine, the fire he had watched Clifton drop down the crack onto a woman they both knew was alive, the shovel he had finally swung too late, the bullet that had spun him into the snow. When Lyman described the fire going down the vent, a woman in the gallery who had wintered her children at the refuge stood up and had to be led out. The jury was gone from the room less than an hour. Clifton was convicted of the assault and the forgery and the shooting and the attempt to burn her alive, and the outlaw treasure he had sworn his wife invented never once appeared in any of it, because it had never existed anywhere but in the letters of a desperate man. She saw him one last time, during the guarded transfer that would take him to the territorial prison. He was thinner, and there was gray in him that had not been there, and when the deputies let him stop in the corridor, he looked at her with something that was almost the old confidence. "That mine would have made us both rich," Clifton said. "You know that. One good pocket, worked right, and neither of us would ever have wanted for anything. All of this, the cave, the trial, the ruin of me, all of it because you wouldn't put your name on one piece of paper." "You never wanted the claim, Clifton," Lenora said. "If you'd wanted the claim, you'd have worked it beside me and we'd both have prospered and I'd never have suspected a thing. What you wanted was a thing no one could refuse you. The mine was just the shape it took." She stepped back to let the deputies move him on. "You'll spend a long time now being refused. I think that will be harder on you than the walls." He opened his mouth, and there was nothing in it, and they took him away. He did not die in some final reckoning at her hand. He simply went through a door and became a name in a court record, and the story that everyone in Lincoln County told for the next 50 years was hers, not his, which was the one loss he could never bear, and the one she never had to lift a finger to inflict. By the early years of the 1890s, the whole thing had settled into something steady and unspectacular, which was exactly what Tomas would have wanted and exactly what a lasting thing has to become. The Juniper Bell was never the roaring bonanza Clifton had dreamed. Its one rich pocket narrowed, as her father had always said it would, and Lenora worked it with a small, honest crew and took a modest living from it and refused every offer of speculative money that would have put the claim under another man's thumb. She had learned young what borrowing against a thing you loved could do to you. She kept the controlling share until the day she stopped working it, and never once mortgaged an hour of it. The hardest offer came not from a thief, but from respectable money. A mining syndicate out of Denver sent a smooth man in a linen duster who had done his reading. He did not want only the Juniper Bell. He wanted the cave. He wanted to buy the whole canyon, time the story into a thing people paid to see, put a proper stair down the hatch and a plaque at the ravine, and charge admission to the place where the woman came back from the dead, and run the mine at scale besides. The figure he named would have kept Lenore and her children in comfort for 3 lifetimes. "You'd make it safe," she said. "Rails on the stair, a rope for the tourists." "Safe and profitable both," the man agreed, pleased she understood. "And the first hard winter after you turned it into a show," Lenora said, "when a freight family went over on the canyon shoulder the way they did in '86 and came running for a hatch that was locked because the season's paying visitors had gone home, how many of them would die a quarter mile from a room that used to be theirs?" She stood. "It isn't a wonder, it's a shelter. The day it becomes a wonder is the day it stops being a shelter, and I did not survive that man's fire to build a thing that would let people die for the price of a ticket." She refused the syndicate the way she had refused Coldwell and refused Clifton, and word of that refusal traveled too, and it hardened something in the county's regard for her that no amount of money could have bought. The refuge belonged to no one and to everyone, which was the only arrangement under which a thing like it can survive its founder. The refugee became an institution the way a good wall becomes part of a hill, slowly and then permanently. It held winter grain and folded blankets and trimmed lamps and clean medical cloth and tools, contributed by families whose names Rufa Salazar entered in a bound inventory in her hard slanting hand, and audited with a suspicion that bordered on the religious. No one Rufa held was ever above suspicion of taking 2 blankets when the book said 1, and the county came to understand that the surest way to be publicly shamed in White Oaks was to be short on the refuge ledger when Rufa did her count. She had begun as the woman who would not believe a cave could be safe. She ended as its fiercest guardian, which is the way of the best converts. A day at the refuge in its full season looked like this. On a bright cold morning in late October, before the first real snow, wagons gathered at the head of the canyon and families came up on foot carrying their year's contribution: a sack of pinto beans, a bolt of clean linen for bandages, a can of lamp oil, whatever the written inventory said they owed. Rufa Salazar sat at a plank table at the hatch with the bound ledger open, and nothing came down into the refuge until she had weighed it and entered it and looked the giver in the eye. Down below, in the lamp-lit chamber, Prudencia Mares, the 2-fingered hand, long since a mark of authority rather than shame, stood over a nervous young couple who had just moved out from the settlements, showing them how to read the flame at the low channel. "Steady lean, that's your friend," Prudencia was saying, in the exact words she had been given. "Circles and shutters, you put the fire out that same breath." The Ruiz girl who had nearly stopped breathing one January night was a grown woman now, with a child of her own on her hip, and she carried her family's beans down the passage without being told which shelf, because she had known this cave since she was 7 years old, and would know it until she died. At Lenora's shoulder through all of it stood a girl of 16 named Amparo Salazar, Rufa's granddaughter, who had asked 2 winters back to learn the whole of it, not to visit the refuge, but to run it, and whom Lenora had been training the way Tomas trained her, through the hands and not the mouth. A freighter Lenora did not know came up that morning and wanted to store a load of trade goods below through the winter, and grew impatient at being made to read a candle first. "I've slept in root cellars my whole life," the man said. "I don't need a lesson in a hole in the ground." "Then you don't need this hole in the ground," Amparo told him before Lenora could open her mouth, and she said it flat and final in a way that made Rufa look up from the ledger with something close to a smile. "Nobody uses this refuge who can't find the door in the dark. Read the flame or take your goods to the livery." He read the flame. Everyone read the flame. That was the whole of it. And it was Amparo who had said it, and Lenora understood, watching, that the thing would outlast her now, that she had built not only a machine of stone, but a chain of hands to keep it, and the chain had reached a link she would not have to forge herself. Every autumn, before the first snow, the ritual ran the same. Able hands cleared both air passages and tested the draw with wool thread at each. The dampers were worked and oiled. The food was rotated, the old sacks carried out, and the new marked and shelved 4 feet above the wet. The signal bell was rung and answered. And before any of it, before a soul was allowed to touch a shelf or lay a fire, they read the flame. Dr. Bell himself, gray now and stiff, came to use the chamber as an emergency shelter more than once when the weather caught him on his rounds, though he was careful to say, every time, that a cave was a place to survive a night and never a place to nurse the sick, and he was right, and Lenora made sure everyone heard him say it. The knowledge spread past the canyon, imperfect and alive. Ranches along the freight roads dug earth-sheltered food rooms and storm cellars, and the good ones separated their air from their smoke and kept a second opening high. and the careless ones did not and learned or died. Lenora rode out to help when she was asked and warned everyone who would listen that a dugout in loose ground was not a cave in bedrock, that ordinary earth gave its warmth back too fast, and no cellar in dirt would ever hold a steady 50 degrees the way the mountain did. The lesson that traveled was never find a magic cavern. It was smaller and truer and portable. Slow the loss of heat with earth and stone. Keep the sleeping place dry. Never let the cold draft and the smoke share one throat. Build a second way for the air, and lay in the shared supplies before the sky turned, not after. The proof that it had truly left her hands came the year the little settlement at Nogal, 2 days' ride to the east, built a shelter of their own without asking her at all. They had one of Owen's sheets and one man who had wintered at the Candelaria as a boy, and between the paper and his memory they cut a shared storm room into a bank behind the schoolhouse, 2 openings at 2 heights, sleeping benches above a drainage trench, a shelf of communal grain, a signal bell on a post. When they finished it, they sent for Lenora, not to teach them but to bless it, and she rode out and walked through it and found only one fault. They had set the food shelf too near the smoke chamber, where the heat would spoil it over a season. She showed them, and they moved it, and she rode home understanding that her work no longer required her, that the knowledge now moved on its own, from a printed sheet and a boy's memory into a room full of strangers' children she had never met and never would. That was the day she stopped worrying whether the thing would outlive her. It already had. The printer came into her life through the paper the whole affair generated, which was considerable. Owen Sturgis had lost his wife to a fever 2 winters before, and he ran one of the 2 small presses in White Oaks. And when the court record of the trial and the matter of the outlaw ledger needed to be set clean and printed for the territorial file, the work fell to him. He was a careful, quiet man who cared about getting a thing exactly right, and he found, going through the record, a dozen small errors. A date transposed, a claim monument described wrong, a name misspelled. And rather than let them stand, he rode out to the juniper bell to ask the woman at the center of it which version was true. They spent an afternoon over the papers at her table, correcting the account of her own near-death line by line, and what she noticed about him was not tenderness. It was that he would not print a thing he was not sure of. He questioned every figure. He asked her twice how deep the fall had been, and made her pace it out in her memory and would not write 70 feet until she was certain. It was, she realized, exactly how Tomas had questioned every stone, and exactly how her father had questioned every sample, and it was the only quality that had ever made her trust a man. Most people, Owen said, packing his corrected sheets, want the story to be bigger. You keep making it smaller and more exact. The exact version is the one that keeps people alive, Lenora said. The big version is the one that gets them killed trying to copy it. He came back with the printed record, and then he came back to set the refuge inventory into a proper printed form so it could be copied and hung. And then he came back without any papers at all, and neither of them made much ceremony of it. They were both past the age of ceremony. The thing they built together before they built anything else was a single sheet of paper. Lenora wanted an instruction for a poor family to make an earth-sheltered winter room correctly, and she knew from Prudencia's 2 lost fingers how a good instruction done half right could kill. So she and Owen made it the way she made everything now, by testing it under pressure before trusting it. She wrote out the steps. He set them in plain type. And then, instead of printing 1,000, they gave the single draft to a homesteader, building a room that fall and watched what he did with only the paper to guide him. He read it exactly, and he still nearly went wrong because the sheet said, "Make a second opening high," without saying that the two openings had to be at different heights, or the whole thing failed. The man had cut both holes in the same wall a foot apart. Owen went back to the press and reset the line, and they tested it again on another family, and only when a stranger could build it right from the paper alone did they print it to give away. That was their courtship, such as it was. An old printer and a scarred woman arguing over the exact wording of a sentence that would decide whether people they never met lived through a winter. They married in a quiet way that Rufa pronounced sensible, which from Rufa was a benediction, and Owen moved his second press to a shed near the juniper bell and printed, among the ordinary job work of a small county, that plain corrected sheet, giving it to anyone who asked and mailing it to anyone who wrote. His craft carried her knowledge into households she would never see, farther than her own voice could ever have reached, and it suited them both better than any words about feeling ever could have. The years after that compressed the way full years do. A daughter first, born the spring the second press arrived, and then a son 2 years behind her. Owen's instruction sheet went out by mail to counties Lenora had never crossed, and now and then a letter came back. A family in the Sacramentos, a widower up on the Galenas, saying a bad night had come and the room had held, and Lenora kept every one of those letters in a box beside the refugee ledger, because they were the only proof that mattered to her that the thing had truly left the canyon. She saw the refuge through winters that killed stock by the hundreds and never lost a soul who reached it in time. She saw Amparo Salazar grow into a woman who could run the whole autumn inspection without her, and one October she simply let the girl run it and stood at the plank table beside Rufa doing nothing but watching and knew the succession was complete. The winter Amparo ran it alone for the first time. A mail rider and 2 passengers were caught in a March blizzard on the Nogal Road and reached the hatch after dark, half frozen and past speaking. Lenora heard about it days later, in town, secondhand, the way a person hears about weather in another county. Amparo had brought them down, split them by the good air, warmed them with heated stones and not with fire, and read the flame at the floor through the whole long night. She had sent them on whole in the morning. No one had thought to ride out and tell Lenora, because it was no longer her rescue to be told about. It was simply what the refuge did now, kept by whoever kept it. That was the last proof she ever needed. A thing that still requires its founder has not been finished. A thing that saves strangers while its founder hears of it late and secondhand and is not needed. That thing has become permanent. There was the stiffness that never left the ankle that had never been set right, so that in cold weather she walked with a slight catch that strangers took for age, and that she knew for a signature the mountain had written on her. There was Rufa Salazar, grown old and ferocious over her inventory, who spent her last good years teaching Amparo to audit a ledger with the same holy suspicion she brought to everything, to trust no giver and no taker, and to make the book and the shelf agree down to the ounce. When Rufa died at last, in her own bed at a great age, she died certain the count would go on being kept honestly, which for Rufa was the same thing as dying at peace. There was Dr. Bell's funeral, where Lenora stood at the front because the man who had pronounced her dead had become, in the strange arithmetic of that country, something like a friend. And there were the children, hers and the county's both, whom she would find at the refuge small and unimpressed by a story they were half tired of hearing, and who nonetheless would kneel in the dirt to teach a smaller child the one rule every child in that county eventually learned. They laid flat stones in a little arch and took out the center one and set it back last, reciting the old man's words as though they had invented them. The center stone does not carry the work. It only locks the work, and many small stones carrying the weight together will hold up what no single stone could hold alone. That was the philosophy, and she never once stated it as a philosophy. She only built things that proved it and taught children a rule about rocks and let them carry it out of the canyon into lives she would never see, which is the only way a true thing ever really travels. By the turn of the century, more than 60 households kept a standing account at the Candelaria Refuge, and the shelters her printed sheets had seeded stood along the freight and ranch roads for 40 miles, none a copy of the cave, all carrying its one idea. The truest measure was not any winter it survived, but the way the question changed. Families no longer waited each autumn to learn whether the winter would be cruel. They inspected their vents, rotated their food, dried their blankets, and rang their signal bells before the cold ever asked them to. The ledger was kept as strictly as Rufa Salazar had once kept it. Every missing pound of beans entered as though the fate of the county turned on it, which, in a way, it always had. Lenora Voss Mercer lived out her life near the Juniper Bell, in a plain house within sight of the crooked juniper her father had named the claim for, and not in the cavern that made her name. She kept Tomas's mason's hammer on the wall beside the annual refuge ledger, the stone dust never cleaned from its eye, and in her last years she walked the canyon slowly, the catch in her ankle telling the weather better than any glass. She died in the early years of the new century, an old woman in her own bed under her own roof. The mercy the frontier had given the old man, and her too. Children who never knew Tomas Candelaria were grandparents by then, and still they set flat stones in the dirt and took out the center one to show how it worked. On the anniversary of the day her husband pushed her into the ravine, the snow lies across Coyote Ladder Canyon, the way it always has, filling every hollow in the rock, every hollow but one. The night the cold once fell to 7 degrees and killed stock in 3 counties, it could not reach the woman below, and around the upper vent the stone still stays bare, because the mountain is breathing, warm and slow, the way it always has. The slate hatch remains at the bottom of the ravine, ringed now with a low stone curb, and the iron ring that Lenora's sleeve once caught on has been cleaned by 100 hands and never replaced. Dr. Anson Bell stood at that rim once and told a whole county the only thing a careful man could. No injured person lasted that night down there. He was right about the night. He was wrong about the stone. Below the bare vent, in air that still pulls clean, the shelves hold grain and folded blankets. The mason's hammer hangs from its peg, and a strand of wool at the intake leans always inward, toward the warmth, toward the living. The ring Clifton believed marked her grave became the handle every frightened traveler reached for when the winter closed over the canyon,